The coalition government called its first big education white paper The Importance of Teaching. It was their way of signalling that nothing matters more than the quality of teachers. So, with big changes on the way, what do you need to know about the planned reforms to teacher training? Lambton School in Hounslow is a newly converted academy. It's already a pilot teaching school and as such is a model for the new school-based approach to initial teacher training proposed in the white paper. Based on the idea of teaching hospitals, the plan is to move away from the traditional university-based courses and give outstanding schools responsibility for teacher training throughout their local area.
It will be a bit like a SCIT, a school-based initial teacher training, and that will be the model. So you will actually, I suppose, be part of that school-based provision, and that is where you would actually apply to. And then I would assume that we would have support from universities in terms of some of the, I suppose, some of the theoretical aspects, particularly in terms of subject expertise and knowledge that we would want to put in. So the schools would concentrate on the craft and the pedagogy and the epistemology of teaching a particular subject, but we would still want some kind of link, I would think, with the universities in terms of that cutting-edge subject knowledge that teachers have to have.
The teaching school model is only one part of wide-ranging reforms for teacher training. These include toughening up the current literacy and numeracy tests, with would-be teachers required to pass them early in their courses and with fewer chances to resit if they fail. A possible new hurdle in the form of assessments of aptitude, personality and resilience as part of the selection process. And restricting government funding for PGCE students only to those with first and second class degrees.
We use our classrooms as laboratories, so anybody who wants to work at my school, they're told very, very clearly that they might have a lot of people observing their lessons, usually in threes, in learning threes, because the principle of teaching schools is that you work as a learning three. So that would apply to initial teacher training, but also to other teachers from my own school, but from visiting schools as part of their professional development. We have an outstanding teacher programme, and that is extremely popular, and we have lots of teachers who come and try and hone their particular skills and craft, so that when they go back into their own schools they may be more consistently outstanding in their practice. So from initial teacher education right through professional development, throughout the whole range of the teachers, there is training and programmes which are facilitated by people especially trained to facilitate those particular programmes.
Other changes in the white paper include requiring a greater focus on phonics and keeping discipline in the classroom, expanding the Teach First scheme for high-flying graduates and extending it to primary schools, and creating a Troops to Teachers scheme for those leaving the armed forces, with a compressed qualification for non-graduates. The Institute of Education in London is a leading exponent of the current model of graduate teacher training. About 80% of teachers train in the way they do it here, with students spending 1/3 of their time in lectures and 2/3 on school placements. Chris Husbands thinks the university element is critical.
If you look at the world's best teacher education systems, look at Finland, look at Singapore, look at the Stanford teacher education programme, those are programmes that are university-led because universities have that engagement with research that enables new teachers to ask some pretty fundamental questions about good teaching and good learning.
So in view of that, why do you think the white paper is calling for this shift away from universities and more into schools?
I think that there are all sorts of reasons. One of them is to do with a slightly old-fashioned view that teaching is simply about what teachers do in the classroom. Well, actually nobody running a quality education system believes that anymore. The second is to do with an ideology that has been around for 20-25 years, that teacher training needs to be work-based. Actually, if we look at it, it is substantially work-based, but there are some really imaginative core structures built around that.
In another change, the government is suggesting that the best universities could open training schools, like those in Finland, where trainees can teach under constant supervision of trainers. The overall drive behind the government's reforms is characterised by the Education Secretary's view that teaching is a craft that's best learned on the job. But that view has been challenged by school inspectors. In his annual report, Ofsted said there was more outstanding initial teacher education delivered by higher education-led partnerships than by school-centred training partnerships and employment-based routes.
cutting out the higher education experience, downgrades, for example, the fact that people really need time to reflect on what they're learning. They need to be with their peers who are themselves training and beginner teachers. And also, we believe that there should be a lot more time spent on things like child development, which is not something that you can do in the classroom. You can observe how child development is playing out in primary classrooms, but you need to understand the background to it in order to be able to see that.
The way I think it will operate is that they will be mainly with us, perhaps as a hub, a teaching school hub, but they would have experiences in other schools or clusters around the hub, and we would be responsible as a teaching school for quality assuring the training that they had, a lot of which will be in school, but we might buy in perhaps expertise from universities to support the work of the teachers in our schools. But it's important they have experience of being in an outstanding school for part of their training, because what we're finding is that if some teachers don't have that, they may get into very bad habits by the time they come into a school. And again, if they're not in a school which has very good professional development, that becomes a problem for the profession.
The key job of a school is not to train teachers. The key job of a school is to teach children and young people. And I think it's quite difficult for any school to maintain a focus on those two quite distinct activities at the same time. And what is true is, yes, if the bulk of your training is only in one institution without looking at the broader range of what's available other places and how other people do things, then I think there is a problem with that as a mechanism. That's not to say that there shouldn't be a lot of discussion with schools about how teacher training should work.
If we look at the very best in teacher training, and that's what we should be looking at, the best in teacher training happens when you have schools and universities working together as equal partners, negotiating responsibilities in training, negotiating course structures, negotiating expectations in terms of student outcomes. That can be very positive. I think that the notion that schools running teacher training on their own at scale is something that we've never achieved. Nowhere else in the world has achieved it. I'm to be persuaded that that's a viable way of producing the sort of teachers we need to produce the very highest standards for schools.
Reforms to initial teacher training could take many years to have a widespread impact on classroom standards. That's because the rate at which retiring teachers are replaced by new ones is only about 20,000 a year. That's why some experts say a quicker strategy would be focused on improving existing teachers. But on that, the white paper says relatively little.